So we're beginning this new series. It's January the 15th already. Maybe you're the type of person that thinks, wow, it's just January, or you're the type of person that goes, goodness, it's the 15th of January already, and that maybe 2017 is going to be the same as 2016, that just as about you felt you were getting to grips with the year, it was Christmas time. And, and it was kind of like, whoa, where's time going so quickly? This is a particularly strange month, January is, in the Western world. It can be quite a difficult month for a lot of us. There's a sort of New Year's resolution, is this year going to be any different from last year sort of thing that we go through. Psychologists tell us that the third Monday in January is the most depressing day of the year. And part of the reason they tell us this is because, generally speaking, it's around about the third Monday in January that you get your credit card bills from Christmas. And it's still dark when you go to work in the morning, and it's still dark when you come home from work in the evenings. And this sort of can work in a particularly strange way in this particular month. Divorce lawyers tell us that January is the highest month of the year for applications for divorce in comparison to all the other months. It seems that give us a Christmas together, and that finishes off our relationships. But also, what about the state of our mental well-being, our emotional health? Sometimes January can be a difficult and strange time as we look ahead, and we sometimes wonder, is this year going to be any different from last year? Or if we're the kind of people that perhaps struggle with mental health challenges, it can be a strange time to watch everybody else pushing towards sort of, oh wow, look how great, all this opportunity, and you can be struggling through some of your own personal darkness. In C.S. Lewis's book, The Great Divorce, he talks about this idea of these ghosts upon the earth. And what he imagines, it's a fantasy novel in which he imagines a group of people arriving at this other world en route to heaven. And they arrive at this other world where it's so real in this other world. Everything's so real that they who previously thought themselves real find themselves kind of see-through. They find it hard to walk on the grass because the realness of the grass hurts their feet. And I found that this kind of metaphor relates so well to the challenges of our own mental and emotional life. People will sometimes talk about, particularly people that have suffered with anxieties or depressions, will talk about how it kind of feels like the world is happening around about them, that they're not really fully there, that it's just kind of going on around them. And these metaphors that we use to try and describe the journey that we are on can be hugely important to us as we try and figure out what does it mean to be a person that struggles with fear or anxiety or depression. Fascinating thing for me, and I've been fascinated by this, I remember probably in my early teens first spotting this. In the scripture, the Bible, when it presents its heroes to us, and maybe you've spotted this, the Bible almost categorically fails to ever present its heroes in overly glossy ways. Whenever you meet a Bible hero, the people you maybe grew up learning about in Sunday school, or you've encountered if you've come to faith later, you get them with all of their weaknesses. You get them with all of their hauntings. When you read the stories, the Bible doesn't try and present you, here are some perfect people that followed Jesus or followed God. What instead you get are, here are some people trying to make sense of following God in and through their own life with all of its weaknesses and its own hauntings. The philosopher William James in the early 1900s criticized religion, all religions, for often being focused only on the good. They pursued the good life. And if life wasn't good, William James said, kind of religion started to fall apart and not make any sense. But I want to say not so the Bible, not so followers of Jesus. Because what we find in Scripture is not, here's something for life when it's good, but here's the story and narrative of God working with people who are broken, who have difficulties, who encounter all sorts of challenges, and yet still find a way to work through their following of God in that process. So I want to jump to one of these stories this morning, and that's to the great prophet of Israel, Elijah. In 1 Kings chapter 19, we meet Elijah in this particular story. It goes like this. Now Ahab told Jezebel, so Ahab's the king of Israel at the time, and Jezebel is his queen. Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done, and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. So these were bad prophets, just before you're overly worried, okay? So it's okay. So Jezebel sent a message to Elijah to say, may the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them. So I think this is the first moment in recorded history of what we now would call a Twitter troll. So this is like, I mean, can you imagine, can you imagine Justin Trudeau tweeting something like this? In French and English. Or maybe you're thinking, no, it sounds more like a Donald Trump tweet. Can you imagine the rulers saying something like this in our day and age? But here we have Elijah gets this message from the queen. Just for the record, he doesn't actually get it by tweet. That was only invented more recently. Prior to that, people talked to each other. Elijah gets this message that the queen of the country says, may the gods deal with me severely if you're not dead by this time tomorrow. That's hardly an encouraging message, you might say. But I want you to focus on just this moment here. Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done. Now, if in your study time this week you might want to read the previous 2 chapters just to start to kind of try and locate the everything Elijah had done. It goes something like this. Elijah walks into King Ahab's palace and says to him, God is, the true God is particularly unhappy by your wandering off the correct path. You're following false gods. You've got all these prophets of Baal around. You're leading everything astray. So God is basically telling you that it's not going to rain here for a while. There's going to be a drought so severe that people go to Calgary for the moisture. It says that in the Hebrew version. So Elijah then clears out of the king's palace, and he goes down to this small stream, and he lives by the stream, drinking the water from the stream, and ravens bring him food. So birds bring him food to keep him alive. God sends these birds to do that. Eventually the drought gets so bad that the stream dries up. So Elijah then goes to this little lady's house and says to her, hey, listen, I'm going to come and stay with you, and you're going to feed me while this drought continues. The lady says, well, that's really nice and all, but the problem is I've got this here jug of oil and that there jar of flour, and once that runs out, me and my son, we're finished, because that's us, we're going to die. And Elijah says, well, hey, go ahead and make me something anyway. This is not because he was a deeply uncaring person, but because this incredible miracle happened that for as long as Elijah stayed with this lady, the jug of oil never ran out and the jar of flour never ran out. God provided constantly. But in the midst of this story, the woman's son dies. And she kind of comes to Elijah and sort of like, well, hey, what's going on here? We're looking after you. God's doing this miracle for us, and now my son has died. So Elijah goes into the boy's room, closes the door, and lies down beside him, prays to God, and the son comes back to life. After this, Elijah goes back to King Ahab, and he says to him, God said it's going to start raining again. This is 2 years later. God says it's going to start raining again, but before that happens, we just need to work out a few things, and we need to figure out who the true God of Israel is. So we'll go up to Mount Carmel, and what we'll do is your prophets of Baal will build an altar, and they won't light it. They'll call to their God, and if he lights it, we'll know he's true. And I will go and build an altar to the God of Israel, and if he lights it, we'll know he's true. And then Elijah decides, just to make things more complex, he pours water over his altar. So it's really soggy and wet. Right? Now, you may guess the ending of the story, that Elijah's altar does light on fire. It would be a really strange Bible story if it proved a different point, wouldn't it? But Elijah's altar lights in fire. He puts to death these false prophets. And now this is where we meet him. And that was just 2 chapters of his life. Kind of similar to 2 chapters of your life, right? This incredible providence of God, this supply of God, the miracles of God. And now Elijah, who has survived drought, who has seen provision through oil being and flour never running out, who's seen the dead raised, who's watched God light an altar that was soaked in water, hears that the queen doesn't like him very much and is out to kill him. How will Elijah respond? Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. When he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there, while he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness. He came to a broom tree, sat down under it, and prayed that he might die. I have had enough, Lord, he said. Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors. And then he lay down under the tree and fell asleep. You might want to say, well, maybe Elijah was just having a bad day, right? And he just kind of lost his perspective for a minute. And it'd be quite easy to dismiss the story and go, well, he was scared for his life and let's move on. The trouble, when people who struggle with mental challenges, with mental illnesses or emotional health challenges, it's very easy to dismiss them, to move on and look at what happens next. But whenever I read this story of Elijah, I'm always aware of the fact that this to me sounds so typical of a person who struggles with issues of anxiety, fear, and depression. Because if you look at everything that's happened, you would expect a different response. You'd expect that Elijah had learned enough on his journey to respond differently than the way he does. People with depression often will describe what it feels like to be overwhelmed by depression as having a paralyzing sense of imminence. So Elijah, the man who's seen God do all this incredible stuff, hears that Jezebel is out to kill him and is so paralyzed with fear, he sits down on his own under a tree and says, that's it, I'm done, God. I can't cope anymore. It seems like he's haunted by something that you might want to say seems out of proportion compared to what he's gone through. In his book, The Noonday Demon, Andrew Solomon says this: depression can best be described as an emotional pain that forces itself on us against our will and then breaks free of its externals. Depression is not just a lot of pain. Grief is depression in proportion to circumstance. Depression is grief out of proportion to circumstance. It is tumbleweed distress that thrives on thin air, growing despite its detachment from the nourishing earth. See, now whether you've maybe suffered from mild melancholy or the stuff of major breakdowns, you'll probably relate to Elijah's experience. That sometimes there are moments in life where, for reasons that don't often make sense, a particular event can derail you in a way that people might not expect. People might say, well, look at all this stuff that's gone on in that person's life. Why has this particular thing derailed them? See, because fears and anxieties and depressions, they grip us in not very logical ways. They take over our lives in ways that don't always make sense, and they often are completely out of sync with the proportions of the situation that we're in. But when you're in it, it feels real. It feels apparent, and it's the way you understand things. The great Victorian preacher, Charles Spurgeon, who suffered quite famously from anxiety and depression, and unusually for a man of his time in the late 19th century, was willing to talk about it publicly. Spurgeon said this in one of his sermons: "The mind can descend far lower than the body, for in it there are bottomless pits. The flesh can bear only a certain number of wounds, and no more. But the soul can bleed in 10,000 ways and die over and over again each hour." The difficulty, however, of trying to deal with mental anguish or mental illness is that we live in a world that isn't quite sure what to do with it. When people talk about overwhelming fears or clinical depression or identified anxiety, some people are just not convinced they're real. And you don't need to talk to many people who have suffered from depression or anxiety to hear that someone at some point will have told them, kind of just snap out of it. Pull yourself together, get a grip. As if it's something that they're choosing to be like or choosing to be in. Mary Nana Amadankwa, a writer who writes beautifully on the subject of depression, says this: anyone who's ever really been sick knows that the tolerance level for illness is low. Once the get-well rosies begin to wilt, everything changes. Compassion and caretaking turn into burdens, and vulnerability becomes weakness. If the illness is something as nebulous as depression, folks begin to treat it like a character flaw. You are lazy, incapable, selfish, self-absorbed. And this is true of wider society. This is what Dankwa is talking about, the Western world. But I think if we were honest, this is also true of the church. The church hasn't always been a safe space to struggle through mental illnesses. I've heard sermons preached from pulpits where pastors have suggested that Christians shouldn't get depression. I've never quite understood how you can say something like that. That'd be like saying Christians shouldn't get indigestion. But if you've ever been to a church potluck, you know that Christians do get indigestion. It happens regularly. I've seen the conversations where Christians are told to just conquer their fears and be victorious in that, as if their anxieties that they carry are voluntarily kept close to them. You know, maybe you've seen the Lego movie with its theme tune, "Everything is Awesome." And some churches try and live to that theme. That it's as if we gather together and say anything other than everything's really great, then we're not being true to Jesus. But that's a strange position for us to hold as Christians, especially when you think that we follow the Jesus who is described as the man of sorrows. Statistics tell us that it's unusual that society struggles to take mental illness seriously, and it's also unusual for the church. Because what we are beginning to notice is that Elijah's seat under the solitary tree isn't actually that rare. See, depression is an illness that's been recorded throughout history. Through ancient documents, they use different language, but you see them describe the things that we would nowadays call anxiety and depression. And sometimes you kind of get this idea that people are saying, well, you know, it's kind of new thing. Everyone's depressed nowadays, right? It's kind of new thing in the 21st century. When I was a kid, nobody got depression. And actually what we're beginning to realize is it's not that nobody got depression when you were a kid. It's that nobody talked about it when you were a kid. But people have been struggling with this for a long, long time. What's scary, perhaps, or significant, depending on what word you want to use, is not so much how long this has been around, is how much it's growing in our modern world. There's something about the Western world that is increasing the rates of depression that we're seeing in and through people. Something strange about our world, that it's getting busier and crazier, and we all know that, but we still stigmatize the people who say, I just don't really want to keep up with the way the world is currently working. Put it like this: 1 in 4 people in our society will experience some mental health problems this year. 1 in 4. It's kind of a scary number if you think about it. Just look around the row in front of you. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. You don't need to travel many rows around this church to say that there's a likelihood that we will struggle with mental health problems in the course of this year. 10% of people in North America can expect a major depressive episode at some point in their lives. And 50% of people will struggle with some symptoms that doctors would identify as depression and anxiety related. In the 1960s, 45 was the average age of the onset of depression. Do you know what it was last year? 14. In the UK, on a child line in the UK noticed a 116% rise over the past 4 years of children calling to talk about suicide. And every 30 seconds in our world, a depressed person kills themselves. But yeah, sure, it's just something we made up, right? It's something in our heads that we're just imagining. The worst thing is this, that 50% of people don't go to their doctors or anyone else for help. 50% of people choose to keep this to themselves. So what that means is that depression, fear, and anxiety are deeply lonely things, as we see from Elijah sitting under his tree. Now, let me say it like this. I am not a doctor. Well, actually, I am a doctor, but I'm the kind of doctor you go and see if your Bible's broke. So I'm not a psychologist. But I speak about this because I think not only is this subject widespread, and I do believe this subject is a very real issue, part of the reason I believe it's a real issue is because it's also my issue. So after a series of what I thought were panic attacks at the time, in early 2015, I went to a psychologist who identified me as suffering with mixed anxiety and depression, suffering with and continue to suffer with. So I suppose I speak from a point of knowing a little bit about this pain. Not as an expert or professional in the field, but as somebody that knows what it is to journey with that. I know what it does to your family. I know what it does to your friendships. I I know what it's like to be looked at a little differently by people once they know this particular thing about you. My last church that I worked at, where the beautiful people were there, but I shared a little bit about this one day. This guy comes up to me after the service and says to me, do you know what you need to do is... Like, yeah, sure. Like, I spend 2 hours a week with a psychologist, but this conversation at the end of the church service, this is going to sort me out, right? So listen, I don't have any solutions. I don't even know about experiencing healing in this. What I do know is my experience. And one of my experiences that I believe firmly in, is that we as Christians and as a community of church have got to work hard to create a space where it's okay to not be okay. The church has got to be a place where actually your okayness isn't predicated on whether you're welcome here or not. See, the idea that life should be permanently happy isn't really rooted in reality. The idea that you should be able to go through life, with no mental illnesses is as ridiculous as the idea that you can go through life without any physical illnesses. This is part and parcel of being human. But what we need and what we should be as a community is a group of people that say, yeah, and we're willing to accept this and understand this and surround you and be with you this time. So part of the reason why I want to talk about fear, anxiety, and depression for the next 3 weeks is because this is part of us ensuring that we continue to be a community where it's okay to not be okay. Where in the same way as we support people with physical illnesses, we support people with mental illnesses, that we lift them up, that we support them, that we help them. And so for me personally, this story that we're talking through of Elijah today, I found it helpful for a couple of reasons that I just want to share with you just now. The first thing is, as the story continues in verse 5, Elijah keeps going. All at once, an angel touched him and said, "Get up and eat." He looked around, and there by his head was some bread baked over hot coals and the jar of water. He ate and drank and then lay down again. The angel of the Lord came back a second time and touched him and said, "Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you." Elijah had an angel. You might not get an angel, but you might need people. And if you talk to people that struggle with overwhelming depression or huge anxieties, what they'll tell you is they don't need people to come and offer them solutions. They don't need people to come in and say, here's what you should do. What they often need is people to come and say, have you eaten anything? Have you been able to get out at all this week? It's in the small little things that this angel works through with Elijah what we should do for each other. If you struggle with depression or anxiety or know someone who does, then you'll resonate with this, that sometimes it's just the simple stuff that's really hard to do. And then this beautiful confession from the angel, this journey is too much for you. For some of us, it does sometimes feel like that. If we're really honest, it probably feels like that for all of us at some point. That can you really honestly look back through your life and say, there's never been a moment where I've thought, goodness me, I don't know how I'm going to get through this. That fear starts to well up in you, the anxiety, and then perhaps even some depression starts to creep in, that you realize this is too much. Elijah has what we all need, which is someone to help him keep going. So he got up and ate and drank, and strengthened by that food, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. And there he went into a cave and spent the night. Think about this. Elijah feels like he wants to give up. He says to God, I wish I was dead. And then here we find him. He goes on this 41-day journey. And he still hasn't heard anything from God. He still hasn't an answer to his solution. And as far as we know, he still feels the same. He's just continuing to get on with what it is that he's doing. And then the word of the Lord came to him. In verse 9, it says this, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Elijah's way off track. He's 41 days and nights journey away from where he's supposed to be, from where God's called him to be. And Elijah's life has spiraled to such a way that despite everything that God has done through him, here he is now in the middle of nowhere, not really sure what's going on anymore. And Elijah replies, and I relate so much to Elijah's reply. Elijah kind of goes, well, seriously, God, I'm trying really hard, but I'm all on my own. He goes, I've been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. And I am the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too. But the Lord said, go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. The thing that I've noticed in this story is in the darkest moment of Elijah's life that we see recorded, in the moment where he feels like, despite everything that's gone on with him, he's ready to give up. This opens this moment where he finds himself in the presence of God. If you read on, and you might want to do this as the week continues, what Elijah feels in all of the noise and the chaos that comes passing him in the next few seconds, God isn't there, but then there's a gentle whisper, and Elijah realizes that he is in the presence of God. Now, this is a truth that you see throughout the Old Testament, that oftentimes to find yourselves in the presence of God, you have to go through wilderness, you have to go through dark places, and you often find yourself alone. So Elijah, he doesn't feel the presence of God at Mount Carmel when the fire is burning up the altar. He doesn't feel the presence of God when the man is raised from the dead. He feels it after 41 days of thinking, I wish I was dead. And that's where God finds him, meets him, and picks him back up again. This is important for us. As Charles Spurgeon continued in another sermon, depression of spirit is no index of declining grace. Because the problem for a lot of Christians who suffer with mental illness is the perception held by others that it's probably something you're doing wrong that God's let this happen to you. And we've got to be brave enough to realize that actually the opposite may well be true. That sometimes the path that God has called you on still involves you being in dark places. Dark places in your mind, dark places in the world. See, and this should encourage us because Christian hope, and we know this is true, Christian hope, the grace of God, has never been about our ability to hold ourselves up. It's always been about our trust that God can bear us by himself. And here we find Elijah. He feels powerless. He's unable to fix what's going on. He feels like he's absolutely on his own. And it's in that really low and dark place that Elijah encounters God properly for the first time in his life. It's an ugly way to get there, but that's how Elijah gets there. So maybe there's a lesson for all of us in this. Susan Jason says this: I think melancholy is useful in its aspect of pensive reflection or contemplation. It's the source of many things, including the process known as becoming mature. I'm kind of uncomfortable with her use of the word useful there. I'd maybe prefer her to say something like opportune or something like that. But then I realize I'm just arguing with myself over language. What I know is this: Elijah's journey is true. We can find God in dark places. We can go into dark times and come out more mature, with a better relationship with God, with a stronger understanding of how it is that he's called us in the world. How God works is pretty much beyond a lot of us, most of us, all of us perhaps. How God leads us, we don't always make sense of. What I hope that you hear this morning is that we find God with us regardless of where we are. We find God in it. And actually, as painful as it is to admit, sometimes maybe the pains that we go through give us more opportunity to find God than less. When Paul writes to his younger friend Timothy towards the end of the New Testament, and he talks about the pain and the difficulty he's been through for the sake of the gospel, Paul says this: it is no cause for shame. I kind of want to say that about mental illness this morning, that it is no cause for shame. And then Paul adds this: because I know whom I have believed, and I am convinced that he is able to guard what I have entrusted to him until that day. It's a question. We know God's with us. We saw it in the Elijah story. We know he's with us here and now today. The question seems to be, are we willing to trust him to be trustworthy? Are we able to allow him to hold what we can't hold on to? Maybe that's you. Maybe your journey, similar to my journey, is similar to Elijah's journey, that depression and fear and anxiety takes over and spills you out into all sorts of dark places. Or maybe it's a friend, a family, a brother, a sister, a mother, a father, a son, or a daughter, that you are terrified about what it's doing to them. And it seems to me that what I find in this text here is that we have an opportunity to decide whether we're convinced or not that God can care for us and care for them. I've asked Heather just to bring us a song just now. You may know it and you want to sing along. You may want to just sit and contemplate for a moment. And what it simply asks you to think about is this, is use this moment to be convinced that God can sustain you and maybe pass over some of those things that you need his help on to him. Maybe that's a person, maybe that's your own journey. Heather.
Peace be still, you are with me. In this hope I abide. Jesus be my sustainer. Strengthen me in this trial. It's only for a moment, and everything is working for your glory. But I need your perfect love to hold me, safe within your promise till the storm has passed. When this burden is lifted, I'll give thanks to your name. But until it is finished, I'll give praise just the same. And I know it's only for a moment, and everything is working for your glory. But I need your perfect love to hold me, safe within your promise till the storm has passed. Jesus.
Why don't we just stand? Listen, we are aware as pastors that this is just the beginning of a huge conversation for some of you. And although we're talking about it for the next 3 weeks, and we're going to create some space for prayer during this series, but also we know that we need to say more than you can just say on a Sunday morning about this, and we're looking for some opportunities to be able to make space to do that. Pastors are always available to pray with you on a Sunday, so if you do want someone to pray with you this morning, please do just ask. But let me just pray this benediction over you just now, that may you or yours, your friends, your family, your neighbors, the people you love, may you, like Elijah, even if you find dark times, difficult times, and giving up times, may you find God to be there with you. Most of all, may you find him to be real, true, and able to keep you until that day. And may his grace and peace be over you.